Hello, and welcome to a special edition of Up Close on METV. I'm Charles Clapsaddle, Station Manager for Manatee Educational Television. And over the last month, it's been our privilege to bring you several specials on domestic violence. As we all know, October is Domestic Violence Month, but domestic violence goes on 12 months a year. Today, joining us, a very special guest, is Kim Donatelli to talk a little bit more about domestic violence and the impact it has on lives. Kim, thank you so much for being here and sharing some great information with us. And as I mentioned, Domestic Violence Awareness Month is October,
right.
But domestic violence is a situation that goes on each and every month of every year.
Yes.
First of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about the services that you provide specifically for Hope Family Services as a domestic violence advocate and the resources and services that you provide.
Mm-hmm. We have great programs at Hope Family Services. Some people who need our help actually need to come and stay in our shelter, and we would then provide anything that they need while they're staying with us. We have been fortunate enough that 4 years ago we built a 35-bed shelter so that we could accommodate more people in the community. It's kind of bittersweet though, you know, you never thought that we'd need to continue to build bigger buildings. But today we have a 35-bed shelter. When I checked this morning, we had 43 people in it, so we definitely are at capacity. Besides the shelter services, we have a lot of outreach services.
Right.
I primarily, for me, as an advocate, I spend a lot of time with the Sheriff's Office. I work closely with Child Protection Services, right. And I spend a lot of time going to court with clients. Mm-hmm. Maybe they're caught up either in the legal system through right. CPS, or they're caught up in a criminal justice system where they're trying to find justice for the abusive partner that has hurt them. Right. And so my main focus is really to spend time with them and help them through that whole system.
Which can be kind of bewildering to people and overwhelming, I would think, too.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things we've heard and why we want to provide this service is for many people, they feel re-victimized through a system. Because they have no idea, you know, unless you do this every day, right. You really have no idea what to expect when you have to go to court. Mm-hmm. And for many people, they think it's like it is on TV and everybody has their day in court and there's justice at the end. And
it can all be summed up in an hour.
That's right.
That's not the situation
no,
at all,
it's
because there are different policies and procedures right. and dates and times that really have to be adhered to. And for someone who is, first of all, the victim of domestic violence, and then to go through this process, you know, without the services of yourself and other people from Hope Family Services, I can just see it as people wanting to throw up their hands because they have no idea about the complexity of the situation.
Right, and many do. And that's one of the things that we started a project 4 years ago, which is what I'm a part of, working out of the Sheriff's Office and with the CPS, because we were seeing such a low prosecution rate and we were seeing a lot of children being removed from both parents, sure. when really what we're trying to focus on is if we're going to remove a parent, let's remove the battering parent and not necessarily put the kids in care, because now the kids are being removed from both parents, even though the victimized parent is capable of keeping them.
Exactly.
And so really to have this project has been wonderful because we've been able to really talk about more what we call one-parent removals. Right. Let's remove the abusive parent, let them get the services that they need, exactly. refer the other victimized parent to us, because not only with the court process that I can help them through, we have legal referrals so we can actually get them a lawyer if that's the right. case. Many of them need counseling. They need to come in and talk with somebody, exactly. you know, for themselves and maybe their children, so we offer that. We offer support groups. We have a couple different ones that we run every week so people can come and utilize our services for whatever best fits them.
And I think the remarkable thing that this community should know is that Hope has been doing this for many, many years. Yeah. And they develop programs and they have the right resources to try to match those up with the situation at hand.
That's right.
If it has to deal with children, they're there to help children. If it has to deal with, you know, legal representation, they're there to do that. So they have that kind of overreaching type of support mechanism that can help people who are the victims of domestic violence. And I want to stress that word too, because people are victims. They are victims of violence. They're victims of bullying. They're victims, and they don't realize. A lot of women, perhaps don't realize that that they are a victim and they have victims' rights. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And I think one of the hardest things is when people are in an unhealthy relationship, marriage, or living together, and they know that it's not good, but maybe it hasn't rose to the level of physical violence. And for many of the people that finally find our service or reach out for help, they're not sure where they fall on that spectrum. They're not even sure, like you said, if they're really a victim. And so just talking about some of the different behaviors where people gain power over you, and it's not necessarily because they punch you in the face. Sometimes it's so calculating and so manipulating that for many women, primarily women are victims of intimate partner violence, for many women, they don't even know how it got that bad because it's happened so.
It's an accumulative process. And women sometimes find themselves, subjected to this kind of violence and this kind of bullying and things, and by the end of it, they don't have anywhere to turn. And that's a really most unfortunate thing. Now, one of the things that I find remarkable about Hope Family Services and what it does is just the caliber of people. And we should indicate that your executive director, Laurel Lynch, has been doing this for many, many years.
Love her.
And does a wonderful job, and her passion and level of commitment, to victims of domestic violence is tremendous. You couldn't really ask for a better executive director.
Nope, I couldn't. No, she's great. She's absolutely great. I've known Laurel for over 25 years. We've known each other a long time. And one of the things that I like most about going to Hope Family Services and working there is the holistic approach. Is really, even if we don't offer it, because we can't, have every service in our organization, but we work so closely. She's built such good relationships with other community agencies in town that even if we don't directly do that service, we have that relationship built so that we can help people to figure out, maybe who else needs to come into that picture.
And I think that's a remarkable achievement that you've had, is you've built this kind of a community of support and resources and things that are bigger than Hope Family Services, that you're constantly finding other ways that you can help the people that come to you for support and guidance. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about Hope Family Services and what they offer, because I think the key thing, and you mentioned, is that children are sometimes the unintended victims of domestic violence, or they'll remove children from a home, or a wide variety of different things. Tell us what you've seen, what you've experienced, to see how domestic violence affects children.
Well, I'm gonna start with what we saw happening prior to 4 years ago with regards to the children. Because one of the reasons that this project with the Sheriff's Office and CPS is so very important is part of when we're safety planning somebody, if a person comes into our office, we are always safety planning. That's our cornerstone of what we do.
Now let's talk briefly, just for people who may not know what a safety plan is. Tell us what a safety plan is and why that's important.
Well, it's individual, so I can't blanketly say that this is a plan that's going to work for everyone. But if somebody comes into our office, what we try and do is gather as much information as possible as to the history of the relationship, because we want to have the
information,
most indicators on how potentially dangerous this person could be. Because as you mentioned, some people are bullies. Some people are hotheads, they're letting off steam, and maybe if you can separate long enough, then people cool down and there is no more violence. But for some people, that's not the case at all. And leaving, for a victimized adult, leaving their intimate partner can, and usually for many, is the most lethal time. time. And so when we talk about safety planning, so many other organizations are so quick to say, well, just separate, just leave. But for some people, the safest plan is not to leave, it's to stay. And so I want to gather, or the other advocates that work with me, we want to gather as much information, because the person that's coming in through our door, they know their partner. And if they believe that they're potentially lethal, then I believe that, and we're going to work from there. And so what was happening 4 years ago, and even more the past years, but a lot of times one of the things that we talk to people about during a safety planning is please call 911. Please use that service. I mean, law enforcement is there to protect and serve, and they have weapons, and they're going to arrive faster than anyone. So that's just a given that we would have that conversation. But sadly, what we were hearing more and more from people were they won't call law enforcement. And the reason being is because there had been past incident of violence. They had come out to the home. CPS comes out because there are children in the home. And there was such a heavy hand that for many people, they believed that if CPS found out there was more violence in the home, they would take their children. And so we would have many people come into our agency and say, I will never call the police again. And really, we got to take a look at that, because if we have an organization that is set up to protect and serve, and a CPS organization that's set up to keep children safe, and those become the agencies that people are afraid of, we have to reevaluate what we're doing.
And how best, you know, those services can provide those services without fear for the person who is actually the victim.
That's right. So 4 years ago, when this project began, we really started talking about safety planning, appropriate safety planning with CPS, and talking to the sheriff's office so that we can hopefully help law enforcement, because when they go out to these homes, that can potentially be the most dangerous time for them as well. But we want victims and perpetrators interviewed separately. You know, so many times that the heat of the moment, and all of a sudden, you know, well, what did he do to you? And he's standing right there. Well, I'm not going to tell you.
That's right. It's intimidating.
And so this whole process was taking place, and then you'd get to the level of the state attorney's office, and now we, back 4 years ago, had a prosecution rate of 2% or 5% for any domestic violence cases. That's atrocious. And so we would take a look at that and say, well, why aren't victims coming forward? Well, it starts over here, and now we have another process, and now we have this. And so I do a lot of hand-holding, because that's what people have said they need both. I need somebody to go to court with me, I need somebody to go to the state attorney's office with me, and I need somebody to help me through this process
and it's a very emotional roller coaster to go through,
and that's a good way to describe it.
And I would suggest that perhaps a young woman who's gone through, been at the hands of domestic violence, it's all new to her to go through the police report, to go before the state's attorney, to go into a courtroom, and it can be intimidating and a bit overwhelming, because there you have that abuser who's standing right there. So what is that? And I would say, that the services that you continue to provide and the guidance that you continue to give have got to be just vital for people in this community. And there are many, many women who may not even know about the extent of services that HOPE provides, and the hope that HOPE Family Services has for people who are victims. Now, Kim, if I may, I want to take some time here, because one, I want to find out your story. You have a very compelling story that I think this community should know about. And that story is because you suffered at the hands of domestic violence. Over 25 years ago.
Long time ago.
Very young girl, and you were in a very abusive relationship that ended in violence. And you were lucky to be able to walk away with your life. And your friend did not. And if we want to go through that. First of all, you're 18, 19 years old. 18
when I met him.
And you met a young man, and you eventually got married or engaged?
He was actually 10 years older than me. I was 18 when I met him. I brought a child to the relationship. I had my son Adam, who was not even 6 months old when I met my future ex-husband. And so when we first started dating, which I think is important for a lot of people to hear, because back then I didn't know that some of the things that he did or would say could have actually been warning signs for me to maybe make different choices. But I didn't know that because I had never grown up in an abusive house. I mean, we were very loud Italian people, but nobody was afraid of another person. And so I remember actually going on my first date with him. And he had shared a story about being 8 years old, and he would jump out the window and call the police on his father for beating up his mother, and he was the oldest of 4, so his father would, you know, drink heavy and then box him and teach him how to be a man. And I remember thinking, as he's sharing this story, besides the fact that I'm crying and my heart went out to him because I couldn't believe children grew up in houses like that, but in the back of my mind, I was thinking, well, when's our second date? This is very good. This is a nice date. He's nice. But I didn't realize that him potentially harming me later could be, you know, the story that I would then tell, because you would think if it was logical that if he had felt that pain as a little boy, he would never inflict that pain.
And I think, you know, it's a good point, and I'm sure that in your work with Hope Family Services that you found this, is that people who have grown up, not everyone, but a lot of people have grown up in abusive relationships go on to be abusers themselves. Would you think that's a fact?
There's a much greater risk of that happening, which is why I love our children's program, because if we can have some intervention, you know, if so, and I remember thinking that when, you know, I had first left my ex-husband, you know, maybe had somebody helped him when he was 8 years old, maybe, you know, then I wouldn't have been terrified of him when he was 28 years old. However, you know, as a 28-year-old man, he made choices. You know,
so
to
there's not really an excuse.
That's
you know,
right.
We're just saying that, and a lot of people have come from very, you know, terrible backgrounds and have been very successful and have gone on and measured it. So we can't use that as some kind of an excuse, you know, for behavior. But Kim, let's go back to that 18-year-old girl. You know, and probably, you know, just very excited, meeting somebody, you know, having a relationship. But did you begin to see some indicators in your relationship?
He was very dominating, but I didn't necessarily see that as a bad trait. Again, growing up in, you know, just the family that I had, the men were very, you know, loud and powerful. So when he was very, you know, this is how I like things, I didn't see that necessarily as a problem. One of the things that I was most attracted to him about is he told me he could not have children. And so because I brought Adam to the marriage, to the relationship, I didn't want more children at that time. I mean, I really didn't want, you know, more children. So I was very excited that I was in a relationship with somebody that couldn't have them. However, though, what I did is I ended up getting off of birth control because I was now in an intimate relationship with somebody who couldn't have children. I right away became pregnant. And I will tell you...
that's an indicator that it wasn't telling you the truth to begin with.
But I will tell you, as violent as this man ended up being towards me, he never hit me when he found out that I was pregnant. And again, as violent as he was, you would assume that the first thing he would assume was that I cheated on him. And therefore that would have resulted in some kind of, you know, physical altercation or something. And that was never the case. What he had said to me is, I told him I didn't think I was gonna have the baby. And he said, you know, Kim, I didn't think I could have kids and you're gonna, you know, kill my baby, is how he put it. And so of course then, you know, my heart went the other way and I went, oh no, you know, I can have another baby. And we ended up marrying. As soon as I became his wife is when the physical violence began.
Now let's stop there for a moment if we can, because it would seem to me, and you've been around domestic violence for a good portion of your life. is that the first time that you are physically abused has got to be a shock. It's got to be, you know, something. Why would he hit me, or why did I get smacked, or what, you know? And automatically you're thinking, you know, what happened?
Right.
Is that a kind of an indicator for you?
I think you are so shocked that it's almost not believable. And I remember he hit me with a candle. There was a candle on the coffee table. And I was on the telephone, and he actually threw the candle at me. And it hit my arm. And I remember trying to keep myself together, and I just said, okay, I have to go. And I hung up the phone so that I could address this, because I couldn't believe that this had just happened. And he had convinced me that he actually went to throw the candle on the couch where I was sitting, and that I actually leaned, and that's how the candle hit me. And it hit me hard enough that I had a huge bruise on my arm, and it broke the candle. So again, looking back, I know that there's no way that was even possibly true, because there was force behind that. But that evening, he convinced me that no, I just wanted to get your attention, and so I tossed the candle onto the couch, but you leaned into it. And all of a sudden, it was manipulated that it somehow was my fault. And that he didn't mean to do that, but had I not leaned into that, then this would not have happened.
And I think that's another indicator of abusers. They're always trying to spin that, so it's not their fault. It's always somebody else's fault that prompts them, you know, to an act of violence or an act of aggression. And I think people who do that are pretty consistent at trying to spin their behavior to say it's always somebody else. It's not me, it's something else.
And that's something that I bring up today with gals that I work with, is, you know, if people could really listen to their new partners when you're first dating, and if they're not taking any responsibility for why the last marriage ended, or why the last relationship ended, or if they're calling her nasty names, or whatever the case may be, take a look at that, because one day you may be the person that they're calling nasty names.
That's right.
And so the fact that, you know, I think we owe it to ourselves to really listen to people when we're first meeting them, because that could really be a sign for future problems in the relationship, which is, it's not me. You know, we broke up because of her. The marriage ended because of her problems. You know, and so we discuss that a lot with people who are using Hope Services. That, you know, if somebody can't own their own stuff, we all have stuff, but if somebody can't own that, then how ugly could this be down the road for you?
And I mean, that's excellent advice for people that are, you know, developing relationships. Now, did you find as you know, as your relationship, and you know, you're married, you have another child and everything, did you see and experience escalating violence, you know, from that initial, you know, throwing an item at you? Did you get into physical violence, or did it kind of escalate?
It was terrible. There were so many different incidents of physical violence. I remember one time I ran to the grocery store to buy him a pie, and he loved apple pie, and I didn't know how to make an apple pie, so I thought I'd surprise him, and I ran to the store. And I remember coming back, and we had a glass door. In our back door was a glass door, and that's the door that we came in and out of. And so when I got home from the grocery from buying this pie, the door was locked, and we never locked that door. And so I was like, well, why are we locking the door? So I kind of had my hands up against the window, and I'm like, what's going on? And I have, you know, a pie here. And he comes walking through the kitchen, and I really thought he was coming to get the door. And he reached up and punched the glass where my face was, and I actually had glass in my eyes, and it had cut my cornea in 5 different places. I didn't go to the doctor for that. He didn't allow me to see a doctor for that. One time he wanted a bowl of ice cream. I had just finished making dinner and doing the dishes and cleaning up, because, and he was in the living room, and as soon as I came into the living room and I sat down, as soon as I sat down, he said, I want a dish of ice cream. And I kind of went, ugh. Not that I had a problem getting him a dish of ice cream, but 2 seconds ago I was in the kitchen, you know? And so I kind of made that noise, and he got up right away, and he's like, forget it, I'll get my own ice cream. And I said, no, I'll get it, because I knew. And so I ran after him, and I, trying to help him, trying to, make sure he's not that mad at me. And he's yelling at me to go sit back down. So I went and sat on the couch, and he came and sat down next to me, and he actually took the dish of ice cream and slammed it in my face. And I had cut my head open here from that dish. I remember one time I was about 8 months pregnant with Joseph, my youngest son, and he wanted to have sex or an intimate night, and I wasn't going to do that. That was, all day long when somebody's calling you all these nasty names, it's really hard to become vulnerable later. And so I had said no, and he actually ripped my bathrobe off me, and I went and sat in my car naked, 8 months pregnant, and he actually put Adam out the house too, and the two of us sat in the car. And then about an hour later he comes out and he's like, well, come on in. And just that whole switch of,
as if nothing had happened.
As if nothing had happened.
And that shows just like a volatile behavior. I mean, it just shows that level of volatility, as if nothing had happened, but at the same time how crushing and emotionally crushing for you to have to go through that with your son. Eventually, Kim, and how long were you together before you left?
3 years. And
then there was just a continuous kind of volatility?
It got worse year 3, and I tell people now, looking back, that I made one of the largest mistakes that I hear people make. I started threatening him back. Year 1 I could justify it a little bit because he kept saying, well, if you do this better, this would get better. So I spent a lot of year 1 trying to change my own behavior, learn how to bake that pie, different things that would make this a better relationship. By year 2, now I have 2 children, I really knew there wasn't anything that I could do to change his behavior, but now where do you go? This was 25 years ago. People weren't talking about domestic violence the way that we get to today. And so I really felt like I was one and the only person going through this. There's no help out there, so therefore I'm just going to literally stay where I'm at. By year 3, I did the worst thing that I think any woman does, and I started threatening him. I would tell him, if you hit me again, I'm going to leave you. Well, he'd hit me again because that was the relationship we had, but where do you go?
Right.
And so what that did is it gave him the opportunity to even control me more. I was now being monitored, my miles on my car. I was allowed to drive 4 miles a day to get to work and 2 to get home. I had a certain spot at work that I was to park. He knew that spot. If I wasn't in that spot, then he assumed something was different. He had all the money by now, even though I still waitressed and brought in money. There was enough intimidation that I handed over the money. I didn't keep money from him.
And that's a big part of it, to have that control.
Absolutely.
That total control, not just physical, but financial, emotional, all of those controls over the most vulnerable of people.
And he locked up things like our birth certificates. My Social Security, the kids in my Social Security cards. I had a passport. I was born in Scotland, so he had that locked up. So now all these things that you would need if you were to leave, I don't have access to. And so year 3 was very bad, and that's why now today, working with people who are victimized by somebody that claims to love them, that becomes a big conversation. And I'm not here to tell you to leave your partner. That's not my role, or anybody's role at Hope Family Services. But if that's something you want to do, then call me or come in, and let's safety plan to do that, and then leave.
And we talk about having an extra set of keys or a bank account or things that you can have copies made and everything. Things that you can do as a precaution, if nothing else.
Absolutely.
Now, as the violence and the physical violence escalated, and I'm sure this is in front of your children as well, which made it even more kind of a torment for you to have them subjected to this kind of behavior. There came a point in time where you said, I have to go. I can't do this anymore. I can't accept this abuse anymore. So you left.
I did, and again, this is something that I share with other gals that seem to leave when they see it affecting their kids. It's one thing when a lot of times women will put up with certain behavior when they think it's just them. But it wasn't until my husband started abusing Adam that then I knew I had to tell. And as afraid as I was to leave him, I was more afraid of creating men like him. I mean, I could see Adam at the age of 3. He talked to me the way my husband talked to me. Get me a drink, do this. He ordered me. And why wouldn't he? I mean, that's what Daddy did,
Right,
so that's how we talked to Mommy in the house. So, but one morning, Adam had gotten up, he had gotten up to go to work, and I heard Adam crying in the bedroom, and I thought, just another day living in this house. I was so numb to this whole thing by now. And I kind of fell back to sleep after I heard him leave, and then Adam came and woke me up, and he had little black eyes and blood coming from his nose, and I remember thinking, I have to tell. And so I used to waitress at the Holiday Inn for years. I had worked there and throughout my marriage. And I went to work that night, and one of the gals that I worked with, she was one of my coworkers. I later became my best friend. I didn't hang out with my coworkers too much during my marriage, but I had gone into work, and she said, "Hey, how you doing?" And I just started crying in the lobby of the Holiday Inn. And usually I was one of those people that, I could go to work and put on
Hold it inside.
Put on a real happy face and say, let's go make some money and go waitress. But that night I couldn't. And I said to Dina, I said, I'm bawling. And she said, let's go talk. And we went and sat in the bathroom of the Holiday Inn for 5 hours, our entire shift. Our coworkers ended up giving me money to go home and pretend that I had waitress. That's, because I couldn't go home without money. And so I explained to her what the 3 years had been like. And one of the first things she said in listening to the different stories is she said, "Kim, you've got to go. You got to leave." And, it shows you how not logical you can become in living in a marriage like that. Because I remember telling Dina, I'll just wait until the boys are 18 and then I'll leave them. They were 1 and 3. And I remember her saying, Kim, even if you physically live in this marriage for the next 17 years, emotionally you will be dead. And I said, Dina, where do you go? And she goes, I don't know. And so she researched, she found a women's shelter that accepted me and the 2 boys, and we organized that, and I went and stayed in shelter.
And how long were you in a shelter for?
Well, back then I went into a shelter. I did not stay at Hope. I didn't live here in Manatee County, so I went into a shelter that kept you for 6 weeks. I will say at the time that I was brought in, I didn't hear them say I was only allowed to stay 6 weeks, but I eventually found out that was the rules. But I went into shelter. Some of the things that the gals who worked for the shelter had me do were fill out an injunction for protection.
Exactly.
I think 25 years ago we thought that they were going to be this end-all be-all for protection for women. And, being 21 years old and having anybody tell me, do this, it'll help to keep you safe, I was going to do it. And so I filed for the protection order, and it was granted. 25 years ago, though, the protection orders read that he couldn't come inside my house. Well, I was living in an abusive shelter, in an abuse shelter. He wasn't coming inside there. So, which we've since changed some of those rules today, which is great. But ultimately, my stay was up. And the shelter told me I had to leave, not because we were doing anything wrong, but they had to make room for the next victim.
Their guidelines.
That's right. And so I went back and got my job back, and my job was wonderful. They were great to hold my position for 6 weeks. I went back to work. I had a great father that I could call and say, Dad, I need help. And he, rented a little duplex for me, paid the first, last security, all the stuff that goes with it. And then Dina, my girlfriend from work, had become my roommate to help pay for bills because I wasn't divorcing at the time, so there was no child support or any of that. So
let me just stop you here for a minute. So during the 6 weeks and when you moved out, What about contact from the ex-husband? Was there, did he try to contact you? Was he, did he try to kind of wheedle his way back into your good graces? Were there any efforts on his behalf to, try to either intimidate you,
Once I left shelter, he found me. Once I left shelter. And it would go from being very scary to being very sweet. And so, there were many times that he would tell me, Kim, you're doing the right thing. I think we need to separate. And so I would get, I would believe that. And then he would turn around and tell me that, I want to see you dead. You're going to die. So we just kept going round and round. And that's when the stalking began. He spent a lot of time following me around. I would see him on the streets. He ran me off the road a couple times. One time, mysteriously, I had a flat tire. I would assume it was him. I don't know, but he happened to show up where I was to fix the flat tire. So, but I think once he realized that I was filing for divorce and there was no going back, that's when he had told me that his goal for 1989 was to see me dead. And it was December of '88 when he told me that. So.
And when you heard this, and you felt, I'm sure, just like a lot of fear because you saw what he was capable of. What did you do? Did you feel that the authorities needed to be notified, or did you think that this was something that you could handle, or did you feel that did you have enough support system that you could overcome that? What were your next steps?
I knew it wasn't something I could handle. When I was in the marital home with him for those 3 years, I never called the police. I was so afraid of him that unless somebody could guarantee my safety and the boys' safety, I wasn't telling. But when I left him and Dina and I were in our duplex, I called law enforcement all the time.
Good for you.
And sadly, there was nothing they could do. Law enforcement would come to my house. The very nice law enforcement officers would come to my house and they'd say, Kim, it's not illegal for him to come up and down the street. Kim, it's not illegal for him to sit at the church parking lot across the street. Kim, if he gets in the house, call us. Children's toys would start missing out of the yard. Well, you can't prove it's him. And I'm like, yes, I can. I know that it's him. But there was nothing they could do. There were no stalking laws back in 1989, 1988. We started the stalking law in 1994. So now it is illegal to have somebody stalk you.
And rightfully so.
But it wasn't back then. And now we know stalking is a huge precursor to murder. But again, we didn't know we didn't know. And so there was nothing anybody could do. And one of the things that I saw happening is, as empowered as he was while we were married, guess what? Law enforcement shows up and nothing happens. He's more empowered.
Exactly.
And more empowered and more empowered. So now I have a man that wants to see me dead that believes he can get away with anything because he has.
Because there's no recourse for him.
Yeah.
There's no recourse. So Kim, and this is probably a little difficult for you to talk about, but I think there's, a great value in hearing your story. There came a time in your life and with your friend Gina that a terrible situation developed. You, with your children, and Gina, working every day, trying to make a living, getting on with your life. But there came a point where he came to your home. Is that correct? Right.
He had found out where I lived. He followed me home and found out where I lived, and that's when I said he would spend a lot of time across the street in the church parking lot and watch me. And part of the protection order that had been granted for me allowed me to exchange Joseph, my 1-year-old, at the sheriff's office for my safety. That was one of the things the judge had put in place. Well, we did that. I mean, I would load up the children, and every Saturday, every other Saturday rather, I would drop Joseph off and he'd take Joseph, and then I'd go back home. Well, we did this. And finally, one Saturday, I said, I'm not going to do this anymore. I mean, he's across the street. Before I gathered the children to drive to the sheriff's office, he follows me literally to the sheriff's office, and then he follows me home and sits in the truck with Joseph and watches me. So that became visitation, and this was pretty regular. So that Saturday, I wasn't doing it. I yelled across the street, and I said, just come get him. I'm not going to load him up again and drive to the sheriff's office. And I was on the telephone with my sister, and she said, well, keep me on the phone. I said, no, I'll call you back. And so I hung up the phone with her, and he walked in the door. He had an Army coat on, and I didn't really think too much of it. It was January 14th. I mean, not that it was freezing cold in Florida, but it just didn't dawn on me that he had a big, heavy coat on. And I went and sat on the couch. And the way that I sat on the couch, I sat with my back against the armrest, and I had my feet up on the couch. And he came and sat by me, right on my feet. And Adam and Joseph were playing. It was a little duplex, and Adam and Joseph were playing on the other side of the coffee table. And I said to him, I said, Joseph's ready. And I had packed a bag, and he didn't say anything. And he leaned over me, and he put his forearm over my kind of like my neck area and kind of laid me back. And I really thought he was going to rape me. Just the way that he had positioned me, I really thought that he was going to rape me. And then I saw his arm jolt back, and so I looked to see why his arm was doing that. And I realized that he had brought an Italian bread knife, a serrated edge, long bread knife that had a rounded tip, which the doctors say is one of the reasons I lived. And he had stabbed me. And I'll tell you, Charles, our mind is a beautiful thing, because until I saw the blood on that knife, I didn't feel him stab me. Now, I felt the next 11. He stabbed me 11 times or 12 times total. He had went to cut my face, and I blocked it with this hand, and he cut all these fingers. This one was cut off. And then I, in defense, tried to grab the knife, or tried to grab it away from him, but I grabbed the blade and I cut my hand here. And by now, Adam's running down the hall because Dina was in her room taking a nap. We had to be to work for 5 o'clock. And Adam ran down the hall, and I could hear him tell her, come help my mommy, my daddy's hurting her. And I could see her in the doorway, and she was zipping up her bathrobe, and I was yelling to her that he had a knife, and she's yelling to him to stop, that he's gonna kill me. And all this is happening, and he jumps off of me and goes running down the hallway, and I see him stabbing her here in her chest. And I'll tell you, the way I was laying on the couch, the first thing I saw was the back door. And one of the things that I had learned living in a 3-year marriage with him was get outside, because he never hit me in front of the neighbors. You know, our neighbors, when we were married, thought we were a great couple. You know, he presented one way, and behind closed doors, this was the reality. And so with that said, I took off, and I was in the backyard of the duplexes, and now I made it around front. But I ended up losing so much blood that I collapsed about 2 buildings down. And then I learned later that Dina had been stabbed 13 times. He had hit her main aorta within the first or second stab wounds. And so the doctor said that she actually was dying, and he continued to stab her. And she also made it outside, but she died.
Collapsed.
Yeah.
And died.
Yeah.
Obviously, people responded, the authorities responded, and you were rushed to the hospital, and you underwent a great deal of surgery to save your life.
Surgery, yeah.
To save your life.
Yep. I was in intensive care for 6 weeks. Both my lungs had collapsed. I don't have a spleen. I had chest tubes down my throat, and both my hands had been damaged from the knife, so they had done surgery on the hands as well. And
Gina died at the scene.
And her name is Dina.
Died at the scene.
She died at the scene, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was captured almost immediately?
No, almost 3 months later, they found him in Nevada. He had taken off. And that was one of the things. I couldn't speak because I had the tubes down my throat, but I had a great detective that used to come and visit me almost every day in intensive care that was on the case to try and find him. And I said to the detective, I wrote to the detective because they allowed me a spelling board, that we had credit cards, and he said, yes, we're tracking him. and he was traveling throughout the country, and they found him in Nevada, and ultimately arrested him and extradited him back here.
And tell us what he was sentenced to.
He was given life for killing Dina. Life in 1990, which is when we went to trial, gave prisoners a possibility of parole at 25 years. The judge who presided over the case also gave him an additional 30 years, which was the maximum that he could find him for what he had done to me, because I was left for dead and because the boys were present during the attack. So the judge gave him an additional 30 years on top. But again, back in 1990, prisoners were serving a third of their sentence. And so one of the things I tell people, and why I'm so fortunate, not only for Dina saving my life that day, but had that not happened at all, he would have been out about 10, 15 years ago. And so...
And I would say to you, and perhaps you can talk a little bit about this, is the fact that since he is eligible for parole, you as a victim have to kind of relive this again, to write a letter or to go before the parole board to say why this man should never see the light of day again. Is that correct?
That's correct. And now my understanding is they've changed it over the years for victims. They used to have you go back like every 2-3 years and give those statements. My understanding now is you go every 7 so that victims don't have to relive it every 2-3, because you're exactly right. When I got my first letter 2 years ago that he was coming up and had a presumptive release date, it takes you right back to being that 18-year-old lady that's living with this abusive man. So I was quite taken back by it. I was going to appear in person last year when I was asked to, but my father was real sick, so I ended up writing a letter. Actually, I was so busy with my dad. Laurel helped me to write the letter. She says, I know your story. I said, yes, you do. So she actually helped me to write the letter, and we sent it off, and it was read in front of the Parole Commission. And they actually have a new presumptive release date, and it's 2086 for Dina's sentence. So, if all goes well, and every 7 years we have to go back and reiterate why we still want him in there, he will never be released for what he's done to Dina. So.
And rightfully so.
And
not only was she your friend, she kind of helped you on that day, because if she hadn't been shouting and jumping up, obviously he would have continued to stab you.
That's right.
And you would have died there.
That's right.
Yeah. And the horrific part of her homicide and your terrible injuries and the 2 children right in the same room just adds this amount of terror to it. Now we're kind of winding down a little bit, and first of all, Kim, I have to tell you, it takes a tremendous amount of courage to tell the story, and it takes an even more courage, for every day for you to continue to outreach to those dozens and hundreds of women that, that by your advice and guidance can lead a better life.
Right.
And that's a tremendous gift that you've been given, and that you continue to give to all those people in our community.
Well, and I will tell you, Charles, one of the things and why I continue to do this work, because sometimes it can be real hard. People aren't coming in through our door saying, let me tell you about my great relationship. But one of the reasons I continue to do this work is I have to be so grateful for the help that changed my life.
Exactly.
And if I can offer that to somebody else, imagine where their lives can be. And so, I will continue to do this work as long as it's needed. Laurel and I talk about that all the time. One day we could work ourselves out of a job and go do something else. But right now, it's still an epidemic. 1 out of 3 women, 1 out of 4, depending on the statistics you listen to, because you have both of them there. But really, if 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 women are going to live with somebody that claims to love them that they're afraid of in their lifetime, then we have to talk about this.
Exactly.
And hope needs to continue to exist so that people don't have stories like mine. you know, that maybe we know a little bit more than we did 25 years ago.
And I think that's an excellent point, because, you know, domestic violence has a greater awareness now.
Sure.
It's something that one can talk about. There's places like Hope. There's places like Hope in every community that people can go to find the help. And I would suggest that there are very few Kim Donatellis, but the example that you have given and the hope that you have given to the hundreds and hundreds of women that have come has got to be inspiring. And I would say that the work that you continue to do is something that's vital. Now, it's not as if domestic violence is going to stop on a dime. It escalates. It escalates from perhaps shouting to a push or a shove or name calling to something else, but it escalates.
Right.
And the women that have to go through that go through the same range of emotions that you do: disbelief, shock, horror, whatever.
Right.
But it comes to a realization that they have to do something.
Right.
No one should be a victim.
Right.
And what would you say to those women out there to say, if you need help, find help?
I think one of the greatest things that we offer is the 24-hour crisis line, because domestic violence doesn't happen, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. And so the fact that you have a place that is waiting for your call, that is available for you at any time of the day, and for many people, they'll call just to get advice, just to
Sure.
maybe have an idea that they're not crazy, that this is really possibly happening. Because again, the manipulation that happens behind it can be so devastating that people don't even believe they're in this mess until it's too late. And so the fact that we have a crisis line that people can call. If you want to tell us who you are, that's great. Tell us who you are, and we'll bring you in. We can set an appointment. We can meet with you. We can offer you shelter services or whatever the case may be for you. But if you just want to call, back when I did the crisis line, and those 3 o'clock in the morning phone calls are fine with me, and if somebody just wants to call and say, I just need to talk, or I need to get some kind of guidance on what's going on in my life, I think that's one of the best things.
And I would agree with you 100% that people are there. People are at the other side of that phone who want to help, who can help, and provide you with just a little insight and perhaps a little bit of knowledge that can help you.
Right.
So no woman has to go through the terror and the turmoil and the heartbreak that you had to go through. And your friend who probably had a family and was a wonderful future ahead of her.
Yeah.
No person should have to be the subjected to violence, and specifically within a relationship that is supposed to be built on love and trust and cooperation. And I would say that the services that you do continue to be just the most invaluable service that this community can offer to the most vulnerable of all of our residents.
Yeah.
Kim, I can't thank you enough for doing this, and thank you for sharing the story. And I would welcome you back to come perhaps with some other individuals to talk about some of the other resources and how Hope Family Service can really outreach, to provide the protection, the level of effort that women sometimes need.
Thank you for having me here. I appreciate that.
It was our great pleasure, and thank you for having the courage to share this with us. It's just a tremendous story and very compelling. And thank you for joining us on this special edition of Up Close on METV. So just sit here quietly for a minute.